Preliminaries to the siege of Amida. The king set off from this place, delighted to have reduced our men to the miseries of captivity, and confident of further successes of the same kind. 3 days' slow advance brought him to Amida. At the first gleam of dawn, the landscape as far as the eye could reach was aglitter with arms, and hill and plain were covered with cavalry in coats of mail. Towering on his horse above the rest, rode the king at the head of his whole army. He had exchanged his diadem for a helmet in the shape of a ram's head, of gold with precious stones, and his splendour was enhanced by a train of high dignitaries, and an escort drawn from various peoples. It was taken for granted that he would do no more than parley with the garrison, since he was in a hurry to be off elsewhere in accordance with Antoninus' advice. But heaven, whose will it was that the troubles of the whole Roman state should be concentrated within the circuit of a single region, had inspired Sapor with such boldness, that he believed that the mere sight of him would be enough to strike panic into the besieged and reduce them to humble entreaties. So he rode up to the gates, accompanied by his royal escort, and had the hardihood to approach so near that even his features could be clearly seen. His trappings made him a target for arrows and other missiles, and he would have perished under them, had not the dust hidden him from the sight of the marksman, and preserved him, with the loss of part of his cloak, which was torn by a missile, to be the author of countless massacres at a later time. This experience caused him to treat his foes as if they had committed sacrilege. He declared that the master of so many kings and people had been subject to unhallowed outrage, and devoted himself to preparations for the utter destruction of the city. But when his most distinguished generals begged him not to let his rage deflect him from the glorious enterprise he had taken in hand, he allowed himself to be persuaded and decided that on the following day the besieged should again be summoned to surrender. At daybreak, therefore, Grumbates, king of the Chionate, advanced boldly towards the walls with a body of stout men to carry out Sapor's errand. Seeing him within range, a crack shot on the walls discharged his weapon, and the bolt went through the breastplate and breast of Grumbates' son, who was close to his father's side. He was a prince in early manhood, who surpassed his peers in height and good looks. At his fall his countrymen scattered in flight, but shortly afterwards returned, rightly fearing that his body might be carried off, and roused a number of tribes to arms with their harsh cries. When these joined in, missiles flew from both sides like hail, and a fierce fight ensued. This deadly struggle continued until nightfall, when the body, which it had been hard to protect among the heaps of slain and torrents of blood, was dragged away under the cover of darkness, like the corpse of Achilles' friend Patroclus at Troy, over which his comrades fought bitterly. The king's court was saddened by this death, and all the notables joined with the father in his grief at so sudden a disaster. A truce was proclaimed, and the young man, who was greatly loved for his noble qualities, was mourned after the manner of his own people. He was carried out dressed in the armour he usually wore, and placed on a great high catafalque, round which were ranged 10 couches bearing the effigies of dead men, laid out with such care that they looked like bodies already buried. For 7 days all of the men, with their tent mates or by companies, gave themselves up to feasting, accompanied by dances and the singing of dismal dirges. This was their way of lamenting their young prince, but the women beat their breasts in sorrow and wailed in their accustomed manner, because the hope of their race had been cut off in its first bloom. They were like the worshippers of Venus, who are often seen weeping at the sacred rites commemorating the death of Adonis, which in the mystery religions is held to symbolize the ripening of the harvest. Amid surrounded and assaulted, when the body had been burned, and the bones enclosed in a silver urn to be taken home and committed to the ground as his father decreed, a council of war was held, and it was decided to propitiate the spirit of the dead man by destroying and burning the city, since Grumbates refused to let them march forward, leaving the shade of his only child unavenged. So after resting for 2 days and sending out large parties to ravage the rich farmlands which lay unprotected as in time of peace, the Persians surrounded the city with a circle of shields 5 deep. On the morning of the 3rd day, the prospect in every direction as far as the eye could reach was filled by squadrons of horse with gleaming arms. So the various detachments advancing at a slow pace took the positions assigned to them by lot. The whole circuit of the walls was beset by the Persians. The eastern side, where the young prince had fallen with such fatal consequences for us, was occupied by the Chianate. The Cuseni were posted on the south, the Albani watched on north, and the Segetani, the fiercest warriors of all, were stationed opposite the western gate. These last were accompanied by lines of elephants, wrinkled monsters of enormous height, which advanced slowly loaded with armed men, a sight more dreadful than any other form of horror, as I have often declared. Seeing such countless peoples, who had been gathered over a long period to set the Roman world ablaze, concentrated on our destruction, we abandoned all hope. From that moment, the one thing we all longed for was to find a way of ending our lives with glory. From dawn to nightfall, the enemy ranks stood motionless as though rooted to the spot. Not a sound was heard, not even the neighing of a horse. Then they withdrew without breaking their formation, and refreshed themselves with food and sleep. But when night was almost over, the trumpets sounded, and they again drew their awful ring around the city, expecting that it would soon fall. Hardly had Grumbates hurled a spear dripped in blood, according to his native custom and the practice of our envoys at the declaration of war, when the enemy army with a clashing of weapons flew at our walls. Instantly the grim storm of war blew high, as the cavalry advanced at a gallop and threw themselves into the fight, and our men met them with keen and determined resistance. There was much shattering of enemy heads under the crushing weight of the stones hurled by our engines. Others were pierced by arrows, some were transfixed by missiles, and littered the ground with their bodies, while those who were wounded ran in headlong flight to rejoin their comrades. Nor were there fewer sights of woe and death inside the city. Dense clouds of arrows darkened the sky, and the siege engines which the Persians had acquired at the sack of Singara inflicted many wounds. The garrison, recovering their strength and returning to the fight from which they had withdrawn in relays, showed the greatest spirit, but fell when wounded with disastrous effect. Either their torn bodies overset their neighbours as they rolled against them, or else, if they still lived with arrows in them, they called for help from those who had the skill to pull them out. So carnage was piled on carnage, and prolonged to the end of the day. Even the shades of evening did nothing to abate it. Such was the obstinacy shown by both sides. Men watched through the night without laying aside their arms, and the hills re-echoed with the shouts which rose on either hand. Our men extolled the prowess of Constantius Caesar, lord of all things and of the world, while the Persians hailed Sapor as Sanchar, and Peroz, titles which signify King of Kings and Conqueror in War. Before dawn, at a call from the trumpets, the battle was renewed with undiminished intensity, and countless forces moved forward on all sides like birds of prey, far and wide. Wherever one looked, the plains and valleys revealed nothing but the flashing arms of fierce tribesmen. Then, with a shout, all rushed forward in a wild charge. A mighty volley of missiles was fired from the walls, and, as might be expected, in so dense a throng, none of them missed its mark. In this desperate situation, what inspired us, as I have said, was not the hope of saving our lives, but a burning desire to die bravely. From dawn to dusk, the struggle was waged with more fury than discretion, and neither side gained an advantage. Shouts of rage mingled with cries of fear, and the fight was so keen that hardly a man could stand his ground unwounded. At last, night put an end to the slaughter. Both sides had suffered such losses that they allowed themselves a longer breathing space, but even when we gained a chance to rest, the continuous strain which we had undergone without sleep sapped our slight reserves of strength. We were terrified by the blood and the pale faces of the dying, to whom the shortage of space within the walls forbade us to pay even the last tribute of burial. The narrow circuit of the town contained 7 legions, a heterogeneous crowd of strangers and citizens of both sexes, and a few other troops, amounting in all to 20,000 souls. Everyone tended to his own wounds as best he could, or as medical help was available. Some of the seriously wounded gave up the ghost from loss of blood after a long struggle. Others, mangled by sword thrusts, were treated without success, and when they at last expired, their dead bodies were thrown aside. In some cases of extensive injury, the surgeons forbade any attempt at treatment, which would only inflict further useless pain. A number who faced the hazard of pulling out the arrows endured torments that were worse than death. Marcellinus' efforts to surprise the besiegers frustrated. While the two sides were fighting so obstinately at Amida, Marcellinus, chagrined that he was dependent on the will of a man who was his superior officer, kept urging Sabinian, who was still lingering among his tombs, to get together all his light-armed troops and hurry to the scene by a hidden route which skirted the foot of the mountains. With these forces they would be able, with any luck, to cut off the enemy's pickets and fall on the detachments who watched at night round the long circuit of the walls, or at least by incessant pinpricks divert the foe from his dogged prosecution of the siege. Sabinian opposed the suggestion on the grounds that it was dangerous. He produced a letter from the Emperor which expressly enjoined that only operations which would involve no loss to the army should be attempted, but he kept hidden in his heart the instructions that had been dinned into him at the court. These were that he should deprive his predecessor, who was thirsting for glory, of any opportunity of acquiring honour, even if it should be likely to redound to the advantage of the state. So eager were his enemies to prevent the hero from gaining reputation as the originator or partner of any memorable exploit, that they were prepared to sacrifice the provinces to attain this end. Marcellinus, shattered by this treatment, frequently sent us scouts, though none of them could easily enter the town because so strict a watch was kept. But all his helpful schemes could effect nothing. He was like a lion of huge size and grim aspect, which does not dare to go to the rescue of its trapped whelps, because it has lost its claws and teeth. Epidemic at Amida. But in the town, where the number of corpses lying in the streets was too great to allow them to be buried, our troubles were increased by an outbreak of plague, fomented by the rotting of worm-eaten bodies, the humid heat, and the feeble state to which the inhabitants were reduced. I will briefly explain the causes which give rise to this type of malady. Scientists and eminent physicians tell us that infectious diseases are brought on by excess of cold or heat, or of moisture or dryness. That is why people who live in damp or marshy places suffer from coughs and ophthalmia and the like, whereas the inhabitants of hot countries are dehydrated by burning fever. Since fire is the most violent of the elements, drought is the quickest road to death. For this reason, when Greece was sweating through a 10 years' war to prevent Paris escaping the penalty for breaking up a royal marriage, a pestilence of this kind raged among them, and many perished from the darts of Apollo, whom we may identify with the sun. And as Thucydides reports, the severe type of sickness which disastrously afflicted Athens at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War arose in the torrid region of Ethiopia and gradually spread until it reached Athens. Others assert that the air, like water, can be infected by the stench of dead bodies, or the like, and gravely affect men's health, or, at any rate, that minor illnesses are caused by a sudden change of air. There are also some who say that when the atmosphere is thickened by unusually dense exhalations from the earth, it blocks the body's natural vents and sometimes causes death. That is why, as we know from Homer and many later instances, animals which, unlike men, have their heads permanently bent towards the ground are the first to perish when such a pestilence breaks out. The first type of pestilence, which causes the inhabitants of excessively dry regions to be visited by frequent fevers, is called endemic. The second, which occurs periodically and affects the slight and causes dangerous humours in the body, is epidemic. The third is plague, which also lasts only for a time but brings death with lightning speed. We were weakened by this destructive outbreak, and a few died from the excessive heat, which was made worse by the crowded conditions. But on the night after the 10th day, a slight fall of rain dispelled the thick and stifling air, and we regained our health. 2 attacks on Amida. Meanwhile, the Persians were not inactive. Mantlets and penthouses were being erected around the city, and high towers faced with iron were going up. On the top of each of these was placed a piece of artillery to drive the defenders from the ramparts. At the same time, skirmishing by slingers and archers went on without the slightest pause. We had with us, as I have already said, 2 of Magnentius' legions, which had recently arrived from Gaul. They were strong and active men, admirably suited to fighting in open country, but quite useless, indeed, a positive nuisance, in the kind of warfare to which we were restricted. They were no help in working the artillery or constructing defensive works, and from time to time they made senseless sallies, from which, after fighting with great boldness, they returned with diminished numbers, having done about as much good, in the proverbial sense, as a man throwing water single-handed on a large-scale fire. Finally, when the gates were barred and they could not get out against their officers' orders, they snarled like wild beasts. But in the days that followed, they were conspicuously effective, as will be seen. In a remote part of the southern wall, which commands the river Tigris, there was a tower rising to a great height, under which yawned a precipice so steep that one could not look down without fearful dizziness. An underground passage cut through the bowels of the rock, led down by cunningly constructed steps from the bottom of the cliff to the level of the city. Through this, water could be brought in secretly from the bed of the river, and I have seen the same thing in all the fortified places in those parts which are flanked by streams. This dark passage was so steep that it was left unguarded, and through it a renegade townsman, who had deserted to the other side, conducted 70 Persian archers of proven skill and loyalty from the king's own troop. Taking advantage of this remote and silent spot, these men climbed suddenly in single file at midnight to the 3rd story of the tower, where they lay in hiding. But in the morning they displayed a scarlet cloak, which was the signal for battle, and seeing their own forces flooding towards the city on every side, emptied their quivers, flung them at their feet, and discharged their arrows with consummate skill and a concerted yell that set everything alight. Soon all the massed forces of the enemy were assaulting the city far more furiously than before. We were divided in mind whether to direct our resistance against the threat from above or on the host mounted on scaling ladders which already had the very battlements in its grasp. So we shared the work and moved 5 of the lighter engines to positions opposite the tower. These kept up a rapid fire of wooden projectiles, some of which transfixed 2 men at once. Part of the force fell seriously wounded. Others, in panic at the noise of the artillery, threw themselves down headlong and were dashed to pieces. All this was the work of a moment. The engines were then restored to their usual places, and our united efforts enabled us to defend the walls with rather more confidence. The criminal act of the deserter added fuel to the fury of our men. They hurled their various missiles with all their strength, as if they were charging on level ground, with the result that towards noon the tribesmen suffered a severe repulse, and made for their tents, lamenting the death of many of their number, and in fear of further losses. A sally by the Gallic legions. The wind of fortune blew upon us somewhat more favourably, since the day had passed without loss to us and disastrously for the enemy. Its remaining hours we spent in rest and refreshment, but at dawn on the morrow we saw from the citadel a countless host of captives being taken to the enemy's territory from the fortress of Zita. This was a capacious place, with walls more than a mile in perimeter, within which a heterogeneous crowd had taken refuge. These same days had seen the seizure and burning of other forts as well, from which several thousand people were dragged along the road to slavery. Among them were many feeble old men and aged women, when their strength gave out for various reasons under the hardship of the long march, and they lost any desire to live. Their calves or hams were severed, and they were left behind. When the Gallic troops saw this crowd of wretched creatures, they gave way to an impulse which was intelligible enough, but ill-timed. They clamoured to be given a chance of engaging the enemy, and threatened their officers and superiors with death if they persisted in forbidding them. Like wild beasts maddened by the stench of carrion, which hurl themselves against the revolving bars of their cages in an effort to get out, these men hewed with their swords at the gates, which were bolted, as I said before. They were desperately afraid that they might lose their lives without having performed any notable exploit if the city fell, or alternatively, that it might be said that they had done nothing to justify their country's reputation for courage if it were saved. They had, it is true, already made a number of sallies, but in trying to hinder the erection of ramps they had themselves suffered losses equal to those they had inflicted. In our helpless state we could not see how to resist their fury. In the end, the best plan we could hit on, to which we won their grudging assent, was this. Since they could no longer be restrained, they should be allowed after a short delay to attack the enemy's outposts, which were almost within range of our missiles. If they broke through, they could continue their advance, since it was clear that if they were successful, they would create great havoc. While preparations for this were being made, no effort was spared for the defence of the walls. We vied with one another in working and keeping watch, and in placing engines to fire stones and javelins on every side, but a body of Persian infantry succeeded in erecting 2 high ramps, and their preparations for the final assault went slowly on. Our men countered them by devoting prodigious effort to the construction of 2 great earthworks, rising to the same height as those of the enemy, and capable of sustaining even the enormous weight of our fighting men. Meanwhile, the Gauls, refusing to wait any longer, emerged from a postern gate armed with axes and swords, taking advantage of a dark night. It was the night before the new moon, and praying for the blessing of heaven upon their enterprise. As they drew near, they actually held their breath. Then, in close order, they made a furious charge, killed some of the picket, and cut down the sentries outside the camp, who were so far from expecting an attack that they had gone to sleep. They even entertained a secret hope that if luck were with them, they might surprise the very quarters of the king. But, slight though it was, the sound of their movements and the groans of the dying roused many of the enemy from sleep. Each man raised the cry to arms, while our men stood rooted to the spot and dared not advance. It would have been imprudent, now that those whom they sought to surprise were awake, to rush into the obvious danger presented by the hordes of furious Persians who were flocking to the fight from every side. The Gauls stood their ground with unshaken strength and courage as long as they could, hacking at the enemy with their swords, but when some of their number had fallen or been wounded by the hail of arrows which rained down on them, and they realised that the converging battalions of the foe were concentrating their whole weight on a single spot, they made haste to withdraw. None of them, however, turned his back, and when they could no longer sustain the pressure of the ranks facing them, they allowed themselves to be gradually pushed outside the rampart as if they were marching in time to music. The blare of horns from the Persian camp quickened their retreat. These were answered by the sound of many trumpets from the city, as the gates were thrown open to receive our men if they succeeded in getting so far. Our artillery whirled round without firing any shot, so that the commanders of the Persian outpost, who did not know what was going on behind them after their comrades were killed, might abandon their position opposed to the walls, and thus allow our brave men to be admitted unharmed. These tactics enabled the Gauls to enter about daybreak, but with reduced numbers. Some were fatally, others slightly wounded, and their total losses that night amounted to 400 men. If luck had not been against them, they might have slain the king of Persia in his very tent, surrounded by 100,000 men, a mightier exploit than killing Rhesus and his Thracians in their sleep before the walls of Troy. After the destruction of the city, the emperor caused statues in full armour to be set up in a public place in Edessa in honour of the drill sergeants who had led them in this heroic action. These statues have remained intact to the present day. When the battlefield was revealed in the light of day, the bodies of grandees and satraps were found among the slain, and harsh cries and wails showed how fate had struck in different places. There was general mourning, and angry complaints were heard among the kings at the thought that the Romans had penetrated their outposts before the walls. A 3-day truce was appointed by common consent, and this gave us also a breathing space. Progress of the siege. Then the enemy, outraged and infuriated by this novel mishap, lost no more time. Since sheer force was having little success, they decided to settle the matter by siege works. So eager were they for battle that they were ready either to propitiate the spirits of the slain by the destruction of the city or to meet a glorious death. The necessary measures were taken amid general enthusiasm, and as the morning star was rising, various forms of siege engine, together with armoured towers, were moved forward to the walls. On the high tops of these were pieces of artillery, which threw into confusion those who were active in defence at a lower level. When it was getting light, men in mail appeared, in such numbers as to obscure the entire view, and the ranks came on, not as previously in disorderly fashion, but at a slow pace, regulated by trumpet call. No one broke the ranks by running ahead. They advanced under cover of their mantlets, holding wicker hurdles in front of them. When they came within range, the Persian infantry had difficulty in protecting themselves against the arrows shot from the walls by our machines, and adopted a more open order. Hardly a missile failed to find its mark. Even the heavy cavalry wavered and gave ground, which put new heart into our men. But their artillery on the armoured towers prevailed against the defence below. Their superior position brought them corresponding success, and they caused much bloodshed. When evening fell, there was a lull on both sides, and the greater part of the night was spent by us in trying to devise some way of countering this terrible threat. After turning over many possibilities, we adopted a plan which depended for success on rapid execution. This was to bring up 4 scorpions to return the fire from the towers, but while they were being carefully moved into position exactly opposite a very delicate operation, day dawned and brought us great misery. It revealed formidable bodies of Persians supported by lines of elephants, whose noise and monstrous size make them the most frightful objects the human mind can conceive. But while we were beset on all sides by the combined pressure of armed men, siege works, and wild beasts, round stones hurled from the battlements by the iron slings of our scorpions shattered the joints of the towers and threw their artillery and those who worked it headlong down. Some died of the fall without being wounded, others were crushed by the weight of debris. The elephants, too, were forcibly repulsed. As soon as the firebrands which were thrown at them touched their bodies, they bolted, and their mahouts lost control. But though we subsequently burned their siege works, the enemy gave us no rest. The Persian king himself, though he is never obliged to fight in person, was so incensed by these stormy setbacks that he rushed forward into the thicket of the fray like a common soldier. This was a novel and quite unprecedented event. The number of his suite made him conspicuous even at a distance, and he was the target of a hail of missiles. After losing many of his attendants, he withdrew, passing in turn through the lines of his disciplined troops, and at the end of the day, undaunted by the ghastly sight presented by the dead and wounded, he at last allowed a brief interval of rest. Amid a taken by storm, escape of Ammianus. Night had put an end to the fighting and allowed a brief sleep, but at the first gleam of day the king, bursting with rage and resentment and resolved to stick at nothing to achieve his objective, launched his people against us. Since, as I have said, his siege works had been burnt, he tried to carry on the fight by means of high ramps built close to the walls, while our men, who had spared no effort in heaping up a mound of earth on the inside, resisted with equal vigour in this critical situation. For a long time the outcome of this bloody fight hung in the balance. The unremitting courage of the besieged set death at defiance, and the strife had reached a stage when only some unavoidable accident could decide the issue. Suddenly our mound, on which we had spent so much labour, fell forward as if struck by an earthquake. It filled the gap which yawned between the wall and the ramp outside like a causeway or bridge, and presented the enemy with a level surface over which they could pass unhindered. Most of our men were thrown down and crushed, or gave up the struggle from exhaustion. Nevertheless, there was a general rush to avert the danger caused by this sudden catastrophic event. but in their haste men got in each other's way, whereas the spirit of the enemy rose with their success. The king called up his forces to take part in the sack. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued, and torrents of blood were spilled on both sides. The trenches were filled with corpses, which provided a broader front for the attack, and when the furious inrush of the enemy's troops filled the city, all hopes of defence or escape were gone, and soldiers and civilians were slaughtered like sheep without distinction of sex. As it was getting dark, and while a crowd of our men were still keeping up the fight, hopeless though it was, I and two others hid in an obscure corner of the town and escaped through an unguarded postern under cover of night. My acquaintance with the desert and the pace kept by my companions brought me at last 10 miles from the city. There we stopped for a short rest and were about to go on, though I, being of free birth, was hardly equal to the unaccustomed effort of walking, when we encountered a terrible sight, which, however, gave me in my exhausted state a most welcome relief. It was a runaway horse, which a groom had mounted without a saddle or bit, to keep himself on. He had in the usual way tied the halter by which he was leading it tightly to his left hand, when he was thrown and could not undo the knot. So he was torn limb from limb by being dragged over rough ground and through woods until the weight of his body brought the tired beast to a stop. We caught the animal, and I availed myself of his back to reach, though with difficulty, some natural hot spring impregnated with sulphur. My companions were still with me. We were parched with thirst and moved at a snail's pace, looking for water, and we almost missed a deep well. It was too deep for us to climb down, and we had no ropes, but under the spur of necessity we tore our linen clothes into long strips and made a great line, to the end of which we attached a cap which one of us was wearing under his helmet. We let this down, and it sucked up water like a sponge, so that we were easily able to quench our consuming thirst. From there we made a quick march to the Euphrates, intending to cross to the further bank in a ferry boat, which it had long been the custom to keep there for the transport of men and animals, but all at once we saw in the distance a troop of Roman cavalry, with its standards flying in disorder before a host of Persians. We could not tell where they had sprung from to attack so suddenly in our rear. Judging by this phenomenon, I believed that the famous earth-born men did not emerge from the bosom of the earth, but were endowed from birth with extraordinary swiftness. Because they appeared unexpectedly in diverse places, they were called the sown men, and were thought to have sprung from the ground, an ample example of the tendency of the ancients of legendary exaggeration. Alarmed by this spectacle, and concluding that our only hope of safety lay in flight, we made for the higher mountains through woods and thickets, and finally reached Meltene, a town in Lesser Armenia. There we found our general, who was about to take the road, and in his train we returned unexpectedly to Antioch. Defection of Craugasius. Autumn was now far advanced, and the cruel constellation of the Kids was above the horizon. This discouraged the Persians from advancing into the interior, and they began to think of returning home with their prisoners and loot. Amid the scenes of death and pillage which marked the destruction of the city, Count Aelian and the officers who had for so long maintained the defence of our walls and inflicted such losses on the Persians suffered an abominable death on the gibbet. Jacobus and Cassius, paymasters on the staff of the Master of Cavalry, and other staff officers were led into captivity with their hands tied behind their backs. Those who had come from across the Tigris were hunted down with particular care and slaughtered to a man, high and low alike. But the wife of Craugasius, though no attempt was made on her virtue, and she was treated with the respect due to a married woman of rank, was in despair at the thought of seeing another country without her husband, in spite of the prospect of a more exalted lot which present indications afforded. Thinking of her future and foreseeing what would happen, she was a prey to anxiety on two counts. Separation from her husband and a second marriage were equally hateful to her. So she sent her servant, whose loyalty was above suspicion, and who was familiar with the countryside of Mesopotamia, to make his way secretly over Mount Isala between the forts of Meridae and Lorne to Nisibis. He was in her entire confidence, and carried a message begging her husband to join her when he heard her news, so that they could enjoy a happy life together. Charged with this errand, and travelling light, the messenger made a quick journey over rough forested country and entered Nisibis. There he gave out that he had not seen his mistress, who might well be dead, and that he himself had seized a chance of escaping from the enemy camp. In these circumstances nobody took much notice of him, but he told Crogasius how things really stood, and received from him a promise that he would gladly rejoin his wife, if he could do so with safety. Then he went off to carry this joyful news to the woman, who, on receiving it, petitioned the king through his general Tamsapor that, if an opportunity arose before he left Roman territory, he would graciously take her husband under his protection. The unexpected departure of the new arrival, who after returning to his former home had again vanished before anyone was aware, awoke the suspicion of the general Cassian and the other notables of Nisibis. They assailed Crogasius in the most threatening terms, insisting that the man had both come and gone on his instructions. Crogasius, fearing a charge of treason, and haunted by the thought that the movements of the fugitive would bring to light the fact that his wife was still alive and was being most respectfully treated, pretended to be a suitor for the hand of another girl of high birth. On the pretext of making preparations for the wedding feast, he went to a house in the country 8 miles from Nisibis. Then he set spurs to his horse and galloped off to join a band of Persian marauders whom he knew to be in the neighbourhood. They received him with open arms, and when he told them who he was, delivered him 5 days later to Tamsapor, who presented him to the king. He recovered his property and all his family, as well as his wife, whom he had lost a few months before, and he enjoyed a position second only to Antoninus, though in the words of the famous poet Virgil, he came in a bad second. Antoninus owed his position to his natural talent and his long experience, on which he could draw for viable plans in any undertaking. Crogasius was less sophisticated, but equally well known. These events occurred not long after the fall of Amida. The king, however, though he wore a carefree expression and was apparently delighted at the destruction of the city, was at heart violently disturbed by the reflection that the labours of several sieges had involved him in grievous sacrifices, and that he had lost far more men than he had taken alive from us, or than we had lost in various encounters with him, at Nisibis, for example, more than once, and at Singara, at Amida likewise, which he had besieged with a vast host for 73 days. His losses amounted to 30,000 fighting men. This number was ascertained soon afterwards by Diasgenes, a tribune and notary in the civil service, whose task was made easier by the fact that, whereas the corpses of our men fall to pieces and decompose, so that after 4 days they are unrecognisable, those of the Persians dry up like the trunks of trees, without putrefaction or deliquescence. This is the result of their more frugal diet, and of the dry heat of their native lands. Food riots at Rome. While these storms were fast succeeding one another in the Far East, the Eternal City was disturbed by fear of an approaching shortage of grain. The people, to whom the prospect of famine is the worst of all disasters, threatened the then urban prefect Tertullius with violence on several occasions. This was quite unreasonable, since it was no fault of his that the regular arrival of cargo boats was hindered by rough weather at sea and strong contrary winds, which drove them into the nearest sheltered water and deterred them from risking the grave danger of entering the harbour at Ostia. In these circumstances, the prefect, who had often been harassed by riots and was now faced with the threat of imminent destruction from the increasing fury of the mob, gave up hope of saving his life, but he had the wit to take his small sons and exhibit them to the populace, which for all their wild behaviour is apt to be moved by misfortune. These, he said with tears, are your fellow citizens who will share your fate, which heaven forbid, unless our affairs take a happier turn. So if you think that by their destruction you can avert disaster, they are at your disposal. This pathetic speech soothed the mob, which is naturally inclined to compassion. It fell silent and calmly awaited its fate. Soon afterwards, though, the divine providence, which has attended the growth of Rome from its cradle and guaranteed that it shall endure forever, while Tertullius was sacrificing in the temple of Castor and Pollux at Ostia, the sea became smooth and the wind changed to a light southerly breeze. The ships entered the harbour under full sail and replenished the warehouses with grain. Attack on Constantius by the Limigantes. While things were in this uncertain state, Constantius, whose seat of government was at Sirmium during the winter break-in operations, was disturbed by alarming news of a serious nature. The very thing which he chiefly dreaded had occurred. The Limigantes of Sarmatia, who, as I have already told, had once driven their masters from their ancestral domains, had gradually abandoned the places which public policy had assigned them in the previous year, to prevent any outbreak to which their fickle nature might dispose them. They had occupied the regions adjoining our frontiers and were roaming at large in their native way, and if they were not repulsed, general havoc would result. The Emperor, believing that any delay would very soon encourage them to show greater insolence, collected a large force of crack troops from all parts, and took the field before spring had fully come. Two considerations made him more eager to fight. First, that the army which had reaped a rich harvest of loot in the previous summer would be roused to exert itself efficiently by hopes of a similar result, and second, that under the rule of Anatolius, who was then Praetorian prefect in Illyricum, supplies of all kinds had been collected even before they were needed and were pouring in without expense to anyone. It is an established fact that the northern provinces have never to this day been as prosperous under any other prefect. Antonius showed benevolence and skill in the correction of abuses. With a fine show of confidence, he relieved the provincials from the enormous expense of the imperial post service, which had ruined countless homes, and from the hardships of taxation. In fact, the inhabitants of those parts might have lived thereafter happy and untroubled lives with all their grievances settled, but for the abominable refinements of taxation to which they were later exposed. These were magnified to a criminal extent by tax farmers and tax collectors alike, the former confident that they would be safe when everyone's resources were exhausted, and the later hoping that the authorities would protect them in their business. This resulted in the outlawry or suicide of the wretched victims. The emperor, as I said, set out splendidly equipped to relieve the pressure of the situation and entered Valeria. This was once part of Pannonia, but had been made into a province and so named in honour of Valeria, the daughter of Diocletian. Constantius posted his troops in tents along the banks of the Danube and watched the barbarians who before his arrival had been planning under the guise of friendship to invade and lay waste to Pannonia in the depths of winter, while the river could still be crossed anywhere because spring had not melted the snows, and while the frost would make it difficult for our troops to endure long periods in the open. 2 officers, each accompanied by an interpreter, were sent at once to the Limigantes to ask in mild terms why they had left their homes assigned to them when they sued for peace, and why they were roaming at large and threatening our frontiers in defiance of our prohibition. They were afraid to tell the truth and produced vain and hollow excuses, begging the emperor's pardon and entreating him to lay aside his anger and allow them to cross the river and come to him, so that they could put before him the hardships they were suffering. They added that if he pleased, they were ready to move to some distant region within the Roman world, where they would be wrapped in lasting peace and devote themselves to the worship of the saving goddess of quiet, with the obligation and status of a tributary people. When the officers reported this on their return, the emperor, delighted at the prospect of solving without effort a problem which he had thought intractable, decided to admit them to his presence in a body. He was on fire to enlarge his possessions, and his clique of flatterers fanned the flame. They never ceased to remind him that, when affairs beyond the frontier were composed and universal peace established, he would gain an accession of manpower and be in a position to levy strong bodies of recruits, seeing that the provincials will willingly compound for personal service by cash payments, the prospect of which has more than once done damage to the Roman state. Accordingly, an earthwork was thrown up at Aciminum, with a high mound to serve as a tribunal, and at the suggestion of a surveyor called Innocentius, some vessels with light-armed legionaries on board were sent to keep watch on the waters near the bank, so that if they saw any untoward movement among the barbarians, they could attack unexpectedly in the rear, while their attention was concentrated elsewhere. Although the Limigantes were aware of these hasty precautions, they remained standing with bowed heads, affecting to be mere supplicants, but with a far different design in their hearts from what was indicated by their words and bearing. When the emperor appeared on his elevated platform and was about to address them in mild terms as prospective obedient subjects, one of them, in a fit of savagery, flung his shoe at the tribunal, shouting, "Mara, Mara," which was their war cry. Following his lead, the disorderly crowd suddenly displayed a barbarian banner, and with wild yells attacked the very person of the emperor. Constantius, seeing from above the whole area filled by a throng of men running to and fro among the troops with drawn swords and spears, realized that destruction was at hand. There was no time to hesitate or delay, so, thrusting in among the mixed crowds of strangers and his own men, with nothing to indicate whether he was an officer or a common soldier, he mounted a swift horse and went off at a gallop. But a few of his attendants, who tried to stem the rush which was overwhelming them like a spreading fire, either died of wounds or were crushed by the mere weight of their assailants, and the royal chair, with its golden cushions, was torn to pieces without anyone attempting to save it. Soon, however, when it was known that the emperor had barely escaped destruction and was still not out of the woods, the troops, realizing that he was still in danger, took it to be their first duty to help him. Contempt for the enemy increased their confidence, so although the suddenness of the onslaught had caught them only half-armed, they shouted their war cry and plunged into the horde of barbarians, who were resolved to fight to the death. So eager were our men to wipe out the disgrace that had fallen on them and to wreak their wrath upon the treacherous foe that they cut down whatever came in their way. Living, dying, and dead were trampled upon without mercy, and before they were weary of shedding barbarian blood, the dead lay piled up in heaps. The pressure upon the rebels was such that some were slaughtered, others scattered in panic, of whom part who tried to save their lives by vain entreaties suffered repeated blows before they succumbed. When all had been wiped out and the trumpets sounded the recall, some of our men, but not many, were seen to have fallen. They had either been trampled to death in the fierce rush or had met their appointed end because in their efforts to resist the fury of the enemy they left their sides exposed. The most notable death was that of Sulla, commander of the Scutari, who had been the first to rush into the thick of the Sarmatians at the beginning of the fight. After this bloody affair, Constantius took such measures as were urgently needed for the protection of the frontier, and returned to Sirmium, triumphant over a treacherous foe. Then, after dispatching the business which called for immediate attention, he made for Constantinople, where he would be nearer to the east. His intention was to remedy the defeat suffered at Amida, and to reinforce his army so as to check the attacks of the Persian king with numbers that matched his own. It was clear that unless he was repelled by divine providence and the devoted efforts of a large number, Sapor would leave Mesopotamia in his rear and launch an offensive over a wider area. Treason trials. In the midst of these troubles, however, as if in observance of a time-honoured custom, trumpet tones proclaimed, as if it were a civil war, a series of faked charges of high treason, the pursuit and management of which were entrusted to the devilish notary Paul, whom I often have occasion to mention. He was an expert in the art of bloodshed, and looked for gain and profit from the rack or the executioner, in the same way a trainer of gladiators from the business of funeral games or the circus. His fixed and settled policy was to inflict harm, and in pursuit of it did not shirk from fraud or hesitate to plant fatal charges upon innocent persons if it suited him to do so, to keep his damnable trade going. A slight and trivial incident gave him infinite material for extending his investigations. In the furthest part of Thebaid there is a town called Abydos, where a god locally called Bessa used to reveal the future through an oracle and was worshipped with traditional rites by the inhabitants of the surrounding regions. Some of those who consulted the oracle did so in person, others sent a letter to an intermediary containing an explicit statement of their requests. In consequence, records of their petitions on paper or parchment sometimes remained in the temple even after the replies had been given. Some of these documents were sent to the emperor out of malice. His small mind made him deaf to other matters, however serious, but on this point he was more sensitive than the proverbial earlobe, suspicious and petty. He burst into furious anger and ordered Paul to proceed at once to the east, conferring on him as on an experienced commander of great distinction, authority to have cases brought to court as he see fit. The hearing of the trials was put in the hands of Modestus, at that time Count of the East, a man very suitable for business of this sort. Hermogenes of Pontus, who was then Praetorian Prefect, was passed over as being of too mild a temper. In obedience to his orders, Paul went panting off full of deadly spite. the way was open to false accusations on a large scale, and people were brought from all over the world, gentle and simple alike. Some were crushed by the weight of their chains, others succumbed to the rigours of close confinement. The town of Scythopolis in Palestine was chosen to witness the cruel tortures. Two reasons made it seem particularly suitable. It was comparatively secluded, and it was also midway between Antioch and Alexandria, from which most of the victims were brought to be tried. Among the first to be prosecuted was Simplicius, son of the former prefect and consul Philip. He was accused of having consulted the oracle about his chances of the empire. Constantius, who in such circumstances never allowed loyal service to atone for a fault or a mistake, expressly commanded that he should be put to the torture, but by some special providence he escaped with his whole skin, and was condemned to exile in a specified place. Next was Parnasius, formerly prefect of Egypt, a man without guile. Though he had to face a capital charge, he was also banished. He had often been heard to say, when he left his birthplace and home at Patras in Achaia to obtain an official post, he dreamed that he was escorted by a number of figures dressed like tragic actors. Then Andronicus, the celebrated scholar and poet, was brought to the bar, but since nothing suspicious could be proven against him, and he defended himself calmly and confidently, he was acquitted. The philosopher Demetrius, also nicknamed Cythras, a man of great age, but sound in body and mind, was shown to have offered sacrifice to Besser on several occasions. He could not deny it, but maintained that, though he had observed this practice from early youth, his purpose was simply to propitiate the deity, not to inquire into his own prospects of advancement. Nor did he know of anybody who made this his aim. So after a long time on the rack, during which he boldly and confidently adhered to his pleas without the slightest variation, he was allowed to depart to his native city of Alexandria without further injury. These then, and a few others, were saved from the last extremity by the justice of fate, which came to the aid of truth. But as such charges spread more widely, and there seemed no end to the complicated web, some people died on the rack and others suffered the further penalty of confiscation. Paul was the promoter of this theatre of cruelty, continually producing fresh material from his reserves of lies and mischief. One might almost say that the lives of all involved depended on his nod. Anyone who wore round his neck a charm against the quatron augur or some other complaint, or was accused by his ill-wishers of visiting a grave in the evening, was found guilty and executed as a sorcerer, or as an inquirer into the horrors of men's tombs and the empty phantoms of the spirits which haunt them. The matter was treated as seriously as if a host of people had consulted Claros or the oaks of Dondona, or the once famous oracle of Delphi, with a view to the emperor's death. So the palace clique ingeniously contrived a foul form of flattery. They asserted that the emperor would be exempt from the ills common to humanity, and loudly declared that the never-failing providence which protected him had manifested itself in the destruction of those who plotted against him. No man of sense would find fault with a strict inquiry into these matters. I cannot deny that the life of a lawful prince, who is the bulwark and defence of the good and on whom the lives of others depend, ought to be protected by the united efforts of all. When strong measures are needed to defend his authority from violation, no one, however highly placed, was exempt from the laws of Cornelius Sulla, from examination even on the rack. But it is not decent to give way to unbridled joy at such unhappy events. It makes men seem the subjects of despotism rather than of lawful authority. On the contrary, we should imitate Cicero, who said himself that when it was in his power to spare or to harm, he looked for an excuse to pardon rather than to punish. That is the mark of a dispassionate and prudent judge. At this time, Daphne, the delightful and gorgeous suburb of Antioch, saw the birth of a monster as frightful to describe as to behold. It was a child with 2 heads, 2 sets of teeth, a beard, 4 eyes, and 2 very small ears. The birth of this deformed creature portended an ugly development of the state. Prodigies of this kind often appear and signify events of various kinds, but since we no longer make them the occasion of a public rite of purification as our forebears did, they pass over without anyone hearing or knowing about them. Count Larissius checks the raids of the Isaurians. In these days the Isaurians, who had long been quiet after the acts of which an account is given above, and the attempted siege of the city of Seleucia gradually coming to life again, just as snakes are wont to dart forth from the hovels in the springtime, sallying forth from their rocky and inaccessible mountain fastnesses, and massed together in dense bands, were harrying their neighbours with thefts and brigandage, eluding the frontier defences of our soldiers by their skill as mountaineers, and from experience easily running over rocks and through thickets, in order to quiet them by force or by reason. Larissius was sent as governor with the added rank of count. Being a man skilled in statesmanship, he corrected many evils by threats rather than by actual severity, so that for a long time, while he governed the province, nothing occurred which was thought deserving of punishment.